All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of React Wednesdays. My name is TJ VanToll. I work as a developer advocate for Progress, the Kendo React team. And we've got an awesome crew of people here today. So why don't we just go roundtable here and just let everybody know who's here. Dan, you want to get us kicked off?
Sure. I'm Dan Wilson, and I work with Digital Primates doing enterprise React stuff. Jalen?
Yep, my name is Jalen Massey. I'm a software developer at Digital Primates.
Then Dan Skaggs is joining us as well today. Dan, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the other Dan on the show. I'm an engineering manager for a large multinational media corporation.
That shall remain nameless.
Yes.
And Salem, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, my name is Salem. I'm an engineer at Etsy, and I work on a team called the Web Platform team there, kind of like a front-end infrastructure sort of team.
Very cool. So I know we want to talk, monorepos, big projects, and I know at Etsy you certainly fall into that classification. So do you want to just start by setting the scene for us and for chat here of like the problems you're solving, like the sort of infrastructure you have in place at Etsy?
Oh yeah, sure. So let me think. Etsy is a company of about around 1,000 people. I think about somewhere between 300 and 500 engineers. And we have essentially all of our web code living in one code base. And what that means from like a practical JavaScript perspective, that means that we have about 12,000 individual JavaScript modules or files that we have to kind of take care of turning into productionizable code. And that's been the world since I've been working there, which is I joined in about 2015. So things have more or less been the same.
So I want to dive into like all parts of this because it sort of fascinates me. But my first question is about the whole monorepo thing. I want to dive into this because I've worked at a couple different large companies, but all of them were the exact opposite of that, right? It was the many repo situations. And in my mind, having never went through this, because I've always heard of monorepo, like Google like famously does things with monorepos and such. But it's always boggled my mind at how it doesn't turn into chaos. So you maybe just set the scene for me of like at a high level how it works and like how teams can make this happen, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing to make clear is that the monorepo mostly contains our web code, which means that's all of the code for our APIs, our database models and schemas, our controllers, our views, things like that. So there are repositories that live separate to this giant monorepo, and those tend to be things like some of our search code or some specific tooling, some scripts, things like that. But for the large part, we have one big giant repo. I think there's a bit of diligence that has to be done around making sure that everybody behaves the same way in this repo. And I think one of the things that we've gotten a lot of mileage out of is making sure we have really good Git hygiene, for lack of a better word. I think the first thing I was told is every time you do anything, you should be Git rebasing any changes onto your local copy of master. Never just pull, always rebase. I think one of the other things that they impressed was that we should try to have a linear history rather than more like a tree-shaped one. So branches tend to be pretty short-lived. I don't know. This could go in so many different directions. I'm I don't know which threads you want to chase down, but
yeah.
Let's start at kind of a superficial level. If everything for the web and APIs is sitting in this monorepo, does everyone have the same privileges? Everything's available to everyone.
For the most part, yeah, there are some repositories that are only accessible to certain people, like things that store secrets, for example. And as we've started moving to, I think a few years ago we started moving to Google Cloud, and that was a big change about how we think of permissions and things like that. But for the most part, all of the code that is owned at Etsy is accessible to almost everybody. And most people can make commits into any repository that they would like.
Yeah, we have a question from chat too. I think getting at the purpose of the monorepo. So was the intention of moving to help with versioning at all? I don't know if that's versioning of dependencies, or I'm not totally sure. So maybe you can clarify. But maybe I'm curious some of like the benefits you've seen from having a monorepo.
Yeah. Oh, sure. I think one of the things that is one of the clarifications I want to make first is that I don't think Etsy moved to a monorepo. I think it was more like they started using a monorepo and then remained with it over time, just as they moved even from different version control systems to Git, for example. They made migrations like that. But moving away from a monorepo was something that they intentionally did not do. I think there is a number of reasons for this, and I think one of the biggest things that I kind of hear a lot of is that it makes discoverability and it makes reuse very easy and kind of second nature, and it also makes access make sense. Like no one has to worry about whether or not the code that they're seeing is out of bounds or has to worry about reinventing things that don't already exist. We make sure that we have kind of good centralized searching tools to make sure that things are discoverable. But apart from that, that was one of the main reasons that we stuck with the monorepo over time. I think one of the original decisions was to make a monorepo for each language that we used, and we used mostly PHP, and there was some Go, and there was some talk about making a Go monorepo, but I think that was before my time.
I'm curious too. So continuing with the sort of naive questions, do you have performance problems with a Git repo that has 12,000 JavaScript files that are changing all the time? Does it take a long time to rebase when things change, or to push up code? Can Git handle? I mean, and presumably it can, but are there slowdowns? How much slower is it to work with the source control than it would be in just your random web app that you'd have that's isolated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we definitely push the limits of Git and our internal GitHub instance. We have some incredibly smart and dedicated people making sure that our GitHub Enterprise instance remains online and things like that. I think a lot of the performance problems we run into with regards to Git actually come from the fact that we have a lot of we make sure, kind of I mentioned before, we have a lot of diligence around how people use our repository. And kind of part of that is making sure that we have good tooling built around that. And as a side effect, that means we use Git hooks quite extensively. So if we want to make sure people are committing code in a certain way, or if we want to make sure people are including certain annotations with their commits, or if we want to make sure people are not using deprecated libraries, we use Git hooks to kind of make that process a little bit easier. And because there are a lot of Git hooks, sometimes committing a number of commits or rebasing a lot of commits can take a long time. But in general, I'd say it's not the snappiest experience, but it's not more than a few seconds to do most common operations.
What are some of the Git hook examples that come to mind?
So actually, this is one of the first projects I worked on when I moved to the team that I'm currently on was a project to make sure that we were being really diligent about using eslint and using Prettier. And sorry, I'm on the ground floor of an apartment here, so sometimes there's just music on the street.
No worries, it's some good background music.
Yeah,
it's actually been pretty nice. You can kind of look outside and just watch life go by, and then sometimes you realize that people can look inside and watch life not go by. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so we have used eslint. We had used eslint before I moved to the web platform team, but we mostly used it for things that, this kind of gets into the build system part of it, that were not covered by our build system. For example, we had a linting rule to disable trailing commas because some versions of Internet Explorer did not like trailing commas and arrays and would break on them. And our solution was to have an eslint rule to prevent it, to guard against that. And eventually we kind of, without thinking, added I say we, this is mostly before my time, but we added a code formatter, a minifier rather, that stripped trailing commas anyways. So this lint rule is more of a formality than it was actually guarding against anything. But that was kind of the extent to which we used linting. And when we started to take a closer look about how we could use linting, we realized that making sure that people weren't committing things that had linting problems early would be better than waiting until they hit our continuous integration system, which can take 5 or 10 minutes to run, depending on the day and the load. So we figured giving people the opportunity to fail those tests early would be a better solution. So we used the git commit hook because we knew that some people might not have editor integrations or might not want to use editor integrations, and we have a lot of different people developing in a lot of different ways. But a Git hook is something that we could programmatically put on people's development machines pretty reliably.
So you can enforce some standards with that.
Exactly. Yeah. That's like just one of many examples, though.
Got another pretty good question in chat here about merge conflicts. So AOX, oh man, I'm horrible with, we got 5 people here. Anybody got a, I'm really sorry. aoxrud, we'll go with that. Does the monorepo approach significantly increase merge conflicts?
That's a great question. I wish I could give you like a number, because
Take one up. We won't know.
Yeah, just say it like say it really confidently, like that you've done a lot of, like at Etsy, we've done some real scientific research on this. We A/B tested this and we found 52. If you just really say convincingly.
Yeah, we have 2 copies of the Etsy repository that currently exist, and they're both running in parallel, and they're both developed separately, and one is a monorepo and one is thousands and thousands of to be fair, I get merge conflicts sometimes, but I don't feel like it's a regular thing. I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but we spend a lot of time making sure that our commit history is linear, and we encourage people to rebase their changes relatively frequently. One, because it makes sure that we don't have merge conflicts as often, and 2, because being a monorepo, a lot of the times your tests might fail because a particular configuration is set one way and the testing code has changed, and with it the configuration. So making sure that you're pulling newest copy of all the code tends to keep people from failing tests, and they don't want to fail tests. Like for example, back to the eslint example, if we have one version of an eslint config in one world that's been pushed to master, and somebody has an out-of-date version of the repository, when they run their tests on their code, they'll be running their tests using a newer version of eslint than they have on their local machine. So they might expose areas that they didn't know about because they didn't pull newer changes. So I think that's like a pretty ingrained part of our engineering culture, is making sure people pull new code pretty frequently.
And the rebasing part of that is the key, at least in my experience. A lot of people don't understand how the rebase stuff works. Instead, they want to merge. And so in the 3 years that we've been on our monorepo, I think we might have had 4 or 5 merge conflicts that have bubbled up past the local engineer's instance.
Wow.
And it's because of the heavy use and training all of the engineering teams to use the rebase to bring in code to update their local branches.
See, if I go way back in my memory banks, I remember the people saying never use rebase. You never need to use rebase. Like, what changed between then and now where rebase is like the way to do this?
Monorepos got popular.
Oddly enough, that's what I
actually love
talk
to know more
about.
about
Cause effect, you know.
I'd actually love to know more about this too, because I know enough about using monorepos just from that's my lived experience every day at Etsy, but I don't actually know some of the genesis of these decisions. I just know that rebasing is really good. It gives you a linear history, and I don't necessarily know what the alternatives look like. So
we got a question that plays into this with an A+ username, how to do the LOL. I approve of that. But do you find it easier, faster for new team members to get ramped up with a monorepo? I kind of like this because I know for me, I've had experience both in the rebase world and the non-rebase world. And I remember there was a big learning curve for me to just get used to rebasing, not only as like muscle memory, but also as just knowing how rebase works, because it's not the most intuitive thing in the world. Like once you do it for a while, you sort of get it. But I still remember being told like, oh, you have to rebase everything, and going like, you get into like get rebase, and it's like interactive rebases versus non. So I'm curious if you could talk about that, and just even, I guess, as a broader conversation, if it's easier, slower, just to get new people up and running.
That's a great question. I think as always, it's going to be really hard for me to compare a monorepo to not a monorepo. I interned at a company that used a bunch of small repositories, and I have to say one of the nice things about that was that you were working in pretty tight isolation. So there wasn't necessarily the need for me to learn about how the rest of the ecosystem worked. I just needed to know how this one repository worked, how to run tests on that one repository. That being said, like I remember there was a lot of struggles, particularly around getting like a collection of things working together for more like integration or end-to-end tests, and that became a bit of a struggle because you had to like break the abstraction of having just like your one repo being your one world that you had to worry about. I have to say, in support of monorepos, that the ability to just look around all of the code ever and just see how people have been doing things and how they are currently doing things is really useful for learning. It makes discovery really good. It also kind of makes it harder to move away from old patterns. So like if we wanted to make sure that people weren't using, if people were always using arrow functions when we rolled out ES6, for example, we ended up having to rely on eslint to enforce that rather than like just taking a day and updating like the whole repository. We did end up doing that because there's like a good code mod to do that, but like, you know, it's just an example.
So question, if you wanted to enforce like a new eslint rule, like you say, okay, we've decided double quotes are the way to go for this company or whatever, how do you roll out like a change like that? Because I imagine if you wanted to like air out projects, you'd instantly break like potentially thousands of files. Do you have to like make it a warning first, or like what's your procedure for doing something like that?
Well, this is a great question. So part of the work around using like a much stricter, I also have a point about a fun aside about the complexity about learning in a monorepo in 1 second. But part of the work that we did around being more serious about having an eslint config was deciding that we weren't going to cause like failures if there existed lint errors. Our decision instead was to identify additions of new lint errors in a commit and then consider that to be a failure. So whenever somebody goes to deploy code, we essentially run eslint on all of the files that they've touched before we apply their commit. We then apply their commit, and then we see what new, like what errors have increased in any given file. And we do this on a per error basis. So it's not like you have 5 errors and there are still 5 errors, but they're 5 totally different errors, and that's okay. It's like you have 5 single quotes, and now you have like 6 uses of single quotes, and we yell at you for doing that.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's interesting. So you could even tell, like, if you've added a new one, essentially yell at, don't do that. Whereas if it's existing code, it's okay,
Right.
more or less. That's actually kind of clever.
That's an interesting approach. We didn't quite get that in depth with it. We just basically said, if you touch a file, it has to pass before we let you commit it. You know, and in that way, we're only checking the staged files. We're not checking the entire repo that, you know, maybe have thousands of lint failures in it. We're checking what you touched, and kind of a progressive upgrade over time.
So the developer is responsible for bringing it up to the standard.
When you're in it, yeah. In our case.
Do you get pushback from that, like from people saying, like, I just needed to fix this quick bug, and now, like, I have to like dig into the standard? Does that come up?
I can see it happening.
Yeah, it can for sure. In our particular case, you know, our apps are fairly small scoped, and we're an Angular shop with TypeScript and stuff. So we've got the TSLint on top of that even, and so we talked about it amongst our engineering teams. Like, hey, this is the way we want to go, and they all bought in. So we didn't have too much. You know, every once in a while you'll have somebody in a stand-up that says, yeah, that I had to refactor that because of such and such, and it took me an hour or two longer. But that's about the extent of what we've experienced.
Well, the key point there is buy-in. If everybody agrees, then, you know, things are a lot easier than if you're slamming it down their throats and penalizing them.
Yeah. So we had another really good question come in through chat, and I like this one too because it leads into Salem. I know some of the things that you've been working on that I know you want to show as well. But the question is, can you still have a dev build process that permits live reloads on code changes in a reasonable amount of time? Which is like a great leading question. I feel like it almost feels like a plan.
Actually, Jay Knowles works with us, so I don't think Salem paid him off in Etsy swag. But you never know. And if he did, I wear a size large.
Well, I literally just got mailed like Etsy sweatpants. Like, this is we're actually having our engineering week this week. So
you
I'm
get
like
sweatpants?
Yeah, you want to see them?
Yes,
we do actually
you
wanna
must
see them.
Yeah, this is required content at this point because I need to take notes for progress here.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess make sure they have something down the leg because that's really trendy. They say
Okay.
Code as
Oh, that's
wrap.
nice.
TMSE.
Nice.
Yep. And there's like a fanny pack around here somewhere. My apartment's a mess. I'm not gonna like subject you to more of me fumbling around my apartment.
But you've got a great
but,
plant behind you, by the way. We were all just admiring the plant again. It's very fancy.
Oh yeah, it's been I got this when I first moved to New York, and it's just been alive, which is
hanging in there.
Yeah. It's probably not going to live here because it's pretty far away from the windows, but it's really close to where my laptop points. So, okay, are we still able to have a dev build process that permits live reloads on code changes in a reasonable amount of time? The answer is yes, and it took a lot of thinking to do this. I guess this would be a good time to talk about like what we used to do and then what we now do.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Let me do that. Okay, so we used to have this system called Builda, Builda, because it built stuff. Like, we call it Builda. Let's give it a name. And this was something that I think grew from like a PHP script into a standalone JavaScript server that was totally written in-house. It was a wrapper around. Are you familiar with Require.js?
Yeah,
Yep.
you might want to like briefly introduce it for anybody in the chat.
Right. So Require.js is like a dependency resolving library that runs in the browser, and it will make requests for modules that you need over the network and load them into the page. And then once all of the dependencies for something are loaded, it will run that thing. It used AMD style syntax, which is like I wonder if I have like a visual. Yeah, let me see. I have a visual actually on one of these slides here. I have my. I'm kind of cheating. I have the talk that I gave at JSConf pulled up next to me.
Oh, do you want me to pull up the screen so other people can see it?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think I have the right thing up. So this is what AMD syntax looks like. If you're not familiar with it, I'm not surprised. It hasn't been commonplace in quite a while, but it is like one of the first like module syntaxes that got kind of popular as far as I understand it. You list the names of your imports up top. Require is smart enough to figure out how to fetch those from a network or load them if they're already in memory. And once they're all there, they're passed to a callback function that has references to all those modules. And then you just do whatever you want with them. And it's kind of convenient because it's all written in JavaScript. You don't need to do any transpilation. It just you can just put this in your browser and it will just do that thing for you. But one of the things that became like apparent is that if your application got sufficiently complex, having Require make 20 or 30 network calls just to get your application to load didn't really make sense. It made a lot more sense when like your dependencies were like jQuery and underscore, and you just wanted to do some stuff with jQuery and underscore. But if you had like a number of modules, if you were treating code a little bit more like modular, like we kind of think about NPM packages now or like files now, it made a little bit less sense. So Require.js built an optimizer called just Googling here, I hope this works, called the RJS optimizer. And there's this whole beautiful website about the RJS optimizer and all the different optimizations you can do for you. And one of the things that it would do is it would just concatenate all of your modules into one file so that Require, by the time it ran, didn't need to make any network calls. It would just have everything loaded in memory. And that was how I got around the fact that all these network calls could be expensive. So back to Etsy, what this meant for us was that we needed to bake the Require.js optimizer into our workflow a little bit because we wanted to be able to use modules like we use modules today. Individual, encapsulated, isolated pieces of code that we can shift and use and deduplicate and things like that. So we did essentially that. We made a server that watched your files. It watched essentially our whole monorepo actually at the time. And anytime it saw a change to a file, it would just rebuild it would rebuild anything that file was responsible for. And a little bit later, we realized that we couldn't actually watch 12,000 files without like making making like a Git branch change be like catastrophic and take a long time. So they switched to a model where it actually would build files as they came in. So if you loaded up our development environment, you requested a JavaScript file, it would then load that JavaScript file in memory, figure out its dependencies, and then load all those dependencies, figure out their dependencies, et cetera, concatenate them all together and serve it up to you in development. And that was how development worked. Things are kind of built on the fly. This meant that, as long as we could keep builds reasonably fast enough, we could work with this giant code base and not really have to worry about how big it got. That was the state of the world, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago when we first started exploring what the next version of this thing would look like. Using a model like this kind of falls apart as soon as you start thinking about the fact that JavaScript doesn't really stay the same from year to year. It changes a lot. And not only does it change a lot, but it changes a lot in ways that like older browsers don't continue to support. So if we at Etsy still support Internet Explorer 11, which unfortunately we still have to do because we still get a number of people who come from Internet Explorer 11, we needed a way to like bake more complicated things into the build process. And that also meant we needed to be able to bake more complicated things into the span of like one request. And if that one request took super long, that meant that people developing in Etsy would become really frustrated with how long it took to do anything. A good example of that is the ability to support JSX syntax. Transpiling from JSX to JavaScript can take a while, especially if you have a lot of files and your application is rather large. And we ran into that it became pretty gross. It became a little bit more like iOS development than JavaScript development in that you would write a bunch of changes and then you would load the page and then the page would show up 2 minutes later and then you'd be like, okay, my change didn't work. I got to do this again. I'm rambling here. Do you have any questions? Does this kind of make sense so far? Am I missing anything?
Sounds like the bad old days in Java world, right? You go get a cup of coffee while your code compiles.
Yeah, pretty much. It felt like that, except I'm a bit of a novice to the world of engineering, relative to the days when people would compile them and go get lunch and things like that. So
yeah. No, it's and Jalen, I know you've got to take off here in a minute. So if you have any questions you want to get off here, feel free to chime in. There's a few in chat too that I'll bring up here in a minute. But otherwise, I guess go ahead and continue.
Okay, I'll just keep chucking along. So we decided to go with we decided that investigating a more modern open source build system would be a good bet. Specifically because we knew that if it was open source, it would have a bit of community support, which is always a nice thing. But also because if it was popular enough, it might define a bit of a standard for how build systems should look and how support for them would evolve into the future. There was no migration path from our internal build system to whatever the next one would be because nobody knew about our internal build system, and because it was so non-standard. It became a bit of a task to move away from it. So choosing Webpack ended up being the decision because we found it was the best supported, it was the best documented, but it was also the most flexible. And this is also at the time. I know there's so many really beautiful build systems that that have kind of evolved in the past few years. I've seen really cool things from Parcel and Unpackage and there's the open source community is really beautiful, and I'm it's a very it almost feels like a privilege to be able to write JavaScript right now. But Webpack at the time, and I think still was the most flexible thing considering how weirdly shaped our code base was and how many exceptional things we had. We had the ability, for example, to import translations like a dependency. We had the ability to import specific weird templates like a dependency, and Webpack kind of offered a nice abstraction for building your own plugins. It had a lot of support for things out of the box, and the plugin ecosystem was really well developed. So for things that we use that are a little bit more common, like mustache templates, we didn't have to worry about writing our own transpiler for mustache templates that already existed. So
yeah, and actually, it's one of these questions in chat kind of plays into this because, Ella. Is that jalapeno? Jalapeno. That's pretty clever.
I love it. Yeah.
But does your monorepo have separate pipelines for tooling and separate packages are just monolithic tooling. And it sounds like it's more monolithic tooling because everything you're talking about now was like for all of Etsy, right? It wasn't for like one project. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, essentially. So like the old build system really did just build all of Etsy. And if you wanted to add some feature onto it, it would have to apply to all of Etsy. Like JSX support was added as like a Hack Week project, and then everybody in the code base had JSX support whether they knew it or not. Thankfully, they didn't know it, which is kind of a nice side effect.
And then related, because I think this plays into this, does that also mean like same ES config file as well, not project specific? It's like Etsy has an eslint config.
Yeah, we have like a global eslint config, which like enforces a number of our baseline things. Like we use prettier for code formatting, and eslint informs itself based on prettier's configuration. There are like reinforce arrow functions whenever they're used as callbacks, things like that. But we do have a number of other eslint configs for different areas of the code base, and we have overrides as well. Like we use, because of a quirk of how our testing used to work, we use common JS style imports and exports for our tests, and we need to have different linting rules for those. But yeah, for the most part, like if you look at a JavaScript file in like two different JavaScript files in two different parts of the code base, they tend to have the exact same like linting rules applied to them.
Gotcha.
So question
We
I
also
actually have
one kind of
related to the, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I wasn't going to say anything that interesting.
So this is, I guess, related to monorepo versus the multi-repo schools of thought. So there's a lot of at least advantages, it seems like, for the monorepo side of things. But were there any particular, or are there still particular disadvantages in a monorepo that you aren't seeing? Because what it seems like is like, since you have the one monolithic ESLint rule, you can't really configure per project, maybe particular separate things. So were there any like issues that you've had to deal with and just kind of live with the monorepo?
Things that we've had to live with. I think like from a personal opinion, I think one of the biggest drawbacks about using a monorepo is that it doesn't necessarily enforce isolation. So things, for example, I think like a good component is one that is as isolated as possible from its surroundings, so that it's easy to extend. It's a clean abstraction, things like that. But a lot of times you'll see things where like somebody would have liked to add another config to a module, and they add it, and then somebody else wants to use a specific module in a slightly different way, and they add another config. So files might maybe grow over time to fit a plethora of use cases rather than be imported and extended, which might have been like more the case where this repository separated from the repository. It also seems like a lot of the problems that we ran into early on have been fixed by like improved tooling over time, like Yarn workspaces. I kind of mentioned this offhand, like maybe in the pre-chat, but like Yarn workspaces have made it really easy for different parts of our monorepo to use different versions of like an npm dependency, so that we don't have to be in lockstep about which version of React we use, for example, or whether or not we need different libraries to make different parts of the code bases work. That's like the tooling has kind of enabled us to get the advantages of a monorepo, of a plethora of repos that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten from a monorepo.
Gotcha.
So you're even saying all of Etsy is even on one version of React then too?
Before we used Yarn workspaces, yeah, definitely. And like even worse than that, before we used Yarn, we actually had like versions of React checked into the code base. And so we had like multiple versions of like React.js committed to Etsy, which led to headaches, especially when like inside of React, it like requires React-DOM, which like, you know, where does that resolve to? Like which file does that point to? Like there's like a lot of weird side effects of that.
You know, let me just stick with this thought for a sec. A lot of what we're talking about here is sort of a technological process enforcement, but I can't help but think you have a lot of human process enforcement. Like what's the human side look like on this? Is there a lot of one-on-one mentoring? Is there like established standards? Like what do you have to do to get the right outputs?
That's a really good question. I think one of my favorite, like truly one of the best parts about Etsy's culture is that they really enforce blamelessness as like a core tenet. There's like a few things that they uphold as like important values, like the ability to deploy quickly. But I think blamelessness informs a lot of everything else. So when something goes wrong, it's very important for us, for example, that we like look at the thing that went wrong and what about our system allowed that to happen. So, for example, if there's an outage, the understanding the understanding when looking at that outage is that the person who like may have hit the button that may have caused the outage to happen didn't intend to take down the website when they hit that button. They thought that they were doing something that they were supposed to be doing,
Right.
Unless they were like a spy from, I don't know, like some
Shopify.
Evil
Shopify spy.
So like no one comes to work to mess things up. So when things do break, we take a lot of time to make sure that we understand why they broke and then what parts of our process could be improved so that we don't have these problems again in the future. And then we take time to implement things in our system that enforce those things, which is why we use things like Git hooks. And like we have a ton of custom eslint rules, for example. We have a lot of like tooling that walks people through things very clearly. It like feels a little bit patch meal and a little bit duct tapey at times, just because it is like a lot of small iterative improvements to our system. But like that is how we kind of get from like the human aspect of determining what practices we want and how they best fit into people's lives, and then ensuring that they live in the long term.
You did say, and I'm trying to keep notes here, you've got 300 to 500 engineers, right?
Yeah.
How many of those work in the mono repo?
I'd say quite a bit of them. I'd say anything that you see lives in the mono repo. And even some of the things that you don't see live in the mono repo, like like any of our product engineers, I'd say like maybe 200 people conservatively like work in that mono repo. I'm bad at these numbers again, so like take it with a grain of salt, but it's like a lot.
Sound professional enough, so we believe you.
Yeah, exactly. You said it confidently, so yeah.
But if I think through the scale of that, like you've got to have hundreds of people all agreeing to do things basically the same way in an efficient manner. Like this seems like there's a lot of agreements to create and enforce. Like does it work great? Is everyone kind of humming along to the same tune? Do you find that there's opportunities to keep evolving these things? And when you do that, is it easy to evolve them for 200 people?
That's like a great question. Sorry, TJ, were you about to say something?
No, I was only going to add to this that something I found, I really like your ideas behind things like commit hooks and eslint and stuff, because something I found from experience is that it's far easier, like conflict-wise, if a computer is yelling at someone or a compiler is yelling at someone than actual person yelling at it, because then you can at least say, okay, you can point back to like, well, we decided as a group in this meeting that semicolons at the end of our JavaScript was the way to go, and then you can have a rational. Yeah. Because it's so like you feel like a jerk if you're you get like a request for like you're reviewing code, right? And you have to be that person that goes in and goes, well, actually, you should have used double quotes here. That's a great way to just irritate someone. Whereas if it's a commit hook doing it, feels like, okay, like you just go through the process and do that. And at least in my experience, it makes it easier.
And to extend that too, you mentioned, Salem, you mentioned using Prettier for code reformatting. I think that plays into it as well beyond the linting. But, we have all probably worked with somebody that takes half a day to retab, indent something to suit themselves. And this takes all of that away. It's like, as soon as you commit that, or actually before you commit it, we're going to reformat it to the group standard and then commit that. So you've just wasted 4 hours, and don't do that again.
Yeah, and what helps with Prettier a lot too
is
it helps reduce merge conflicts too, because if people have different coding styles and they go to indent certain lines, but they edit the same files, then you run into issues where the lines are in conflict, even though the changes might not actually be in conflict. It's just that somebody wanted tabs or spaces, but you just have the computer do it all for you.
It's a little bit of a holy war.
Yeah. I think that was like.
Sorry, go ahead. I say it can be a little bit of a holy war because, you get people that, no developer's ever opinionated, right? We're all easygoing, right? We don't have our own opinions. But if you set this stuff up front and say, this is what we're going to do, this is our standard for our repo, and it's going to be enforced this way, it cuts the knees out of all those confrontations.
All that being said, though, like we did cover the robotic process enforcement, but I'm curious about the human side of it because, 200 plus people in the same pot sort of stirring it all the time. there's got to be some nuggets here we could take forward with how to run effective teams in this context.
We want a play-by-play of your biggest confrontation you've ever had, right? Like a blow-by-blow.
Yeah, it's where my hair went. Somebody just smacked all my hair off one day. Like I just wanted to like really quickly touch on like a prettier and Go format and things. I love tools like that because they mean that you don't even get to decide what formatting rules you need to care about. Like prettier open source organization cares about that. You have some say about whether or not you like commas or semicolons or things like that, but like for the most part, Prettier decides what things look like, and I think that that's like one of the nicest parts about like using tools like that. Back to the human element part. I feel like I'm speaking for like Etsy at large here, so like take this with a grain of salt. This is like my view of how things are. There are like some pros and cons to the fact that we're like so many people working on one code base. One of those both pro and con things is that there's like room for anybody to like play around with how we might better improve our systems. Like, for example, I used to be a product engineer at Etsy, and I'm now on this more infrastructure-y shaped team, and that was because like I was really interested in improving the processes around how we wrote product code. But as a product engineer, I totally had the ability to play around with things that would make tooling a little bit better. I was able to I wrote like a type checker for this wrapper around immutable.js that we used to make sure that if you made a change to our React state, it would continue to conform to the same type. This is before like TypeScript was even like a pipe dream for Etsy. Like we didn't even have Webpack. We were using this weird build system. Like it was not going to happen. And like that was something that was like possible for me to write as a product engineer. Because I had access to the whole code base, I was able to like show this to whoever I wanted to. I was able to implement it kind of on my own. But of course, like with this comes the fact that like because the whole code base is full of people like this, there's sometimes like conflicts in implementation. Like a very similar, like two separate engineers implemented different ways of modeling data on the client side. That wrapper around immutable.js I just kind of mentioned. Almost at the same time, and because there were these two separate implementations, we had to kind of reconcile which of the two we would be using in that particular part of the code base. And to this day, there's like remnants of that code laying around. Like you could have a whole conversation about tech debt and updating a whole code base, but it is kind of like part of the cost of having a monorepo is the fact that like every code could be everywhere.
Well, this sort of ties into something that Dan Skaggs is doing too, so hopefully both of you can chime in. But it seems like if you have these large monorepos with lots of features and functionality, it can almost be daunting for an engineer to know what is available and how to use it. And one thing we see a lot outside of this internal monorepo groups is there are repeating solutions. People will design a solution that fits their specific use case and avoid other solutions because they don't want to take the time to learn someone else's code. Like, what do you do about those challenges at Etsy? Are you marketing features and capabilities for reuse? Is there a way for people to get notified? Like, how do you do the bake off between which solution to use?
I would also, I'll say my bit, and I'd also love to hear Dan Skaggs. I'd love to know what you are doing as well for this kind of thing, because this is something that I feel like is not like a fully baked solution. But a lot of like what I do or what we do on the web platform team at Etsy is we think about ways to make sure that tools that we develop or strategies that we use are baked into how people develop at Etsy. So, kind of I mentioned that we updated how we use eslint, and part of that was to make sure that it was integrated in our editors as best as possible. It was integrated in the Git commit hook. There was tons of documentation that we could point to. Another bit of work we've been doing recently is migrating from Jasmine tests to Jest tests, which has been like really delightful. Honestly, Jest has been like a surprisingly easy thing to move to. And the engineer who kind of is in charge of the most of that work spent a lot of time like building out graphs to see when people are writing which types of tests, adding annotations to the code base and alerts to the code base to make sure that if people were to write old styles of tests, that they would know that this is not the way to be doing things. He created a code generator to make it really simple to migrate tests from the old to the new. So it's it's equal parts building the thing, but then also socializing it, marketing it, making it easy to use. I think like it's a little bit it's almost competitive. Like one of our old directors used to say that infrastructure's like top competitor was product engineering, just because like if we don't fix it, then they will find a ways to fix it for themselves. Yeah, that's my bit.
I'm going to butt in here really quickly. I have to hop off, but it was really great talking to all of you guys. Thank you.
Yeah,
All right,
thanks, Jalen.
See you,
And it's
Jalen.
Coming
meeting
in.
you.
Yeah.
He's a cool guy. Skaggs?
So I think from our perspective, a little bit different scale. Our monorepo is like a lot of companies. There's very few companies around that have one true monorepo, right? Google is really close. We've got repos all over the place. The monorepo that I deal with is for our front end applications for a suite of apps that we built. What we do there is we got some tooling that we adopted early on to manage. Pretty opinionated in managing where these shared libraries and things go that development teams can pull into their applications that they're developing within the repo. And because all of that's in that one kind of shared library hierarchy within the repo, and all of our teams are looking at pull requests all day long, it at a minimum, like each team lead, the way it worked out is our team leads were probably the ones that spent the most time doing PR reviews. And so they would be aware of a new library has been added. And a lot of times, I'm watching them too as we go, but we'll do a monthly newsletter with talking about new things that have been added, and that becomes important not only for the engineering teams but for managing up, to give our leadership a better view of actually everything, all the good work that the engineering teams are doing within the repo. So there's some manual marketing that goes on, out to the engineering teams individually that might not have seen that stuff, but then also up. And then, like somebody mentioned documentation, when we put in a new repo, we have a rule. It's kind of, I can't automatically enforce it, but we've gotten to the point over the last 3 years that if you put in a new shared library, then we've got a spot on our Confluence that is, we need to put some documentation in there, and it has to have a README in the code base itself to tell what it does and how it's used and that kind of thing. So I think it's important for both.
So you've got kind of a product mindset for these shared modules.
You sort of what we look at it, yeah, because the idea is that we build these shared libraries with the intention that not only the team that's building it will be using it. And so, knowing that up front guides a little bit of how we build it and how we document and expose it to the other folks.
Nice. Salem, one of the ways we found you was you wrote an article explaining some of this process and how you migrated to Webpack, which had some issues, and you created this middleware component called Kevin. I wonder if now's an appropriate time to start having a chat about this mysterious Kevin and what it does and how it works and why it was needed and how people can get involved if they like it.
And why it's named Kevin.
Yeah, we got to hear that
Great
part.
question. Let me start with how it's named. I guess so. I work on a team with I'm bad at counting. I think 4 or 5 people depending on the time of the year. And we were sitting around at the time trying to figure out what to name this thing, because we knew we needed to make it. I kind of wanted to figure out just a name to run with before I started making it. And I was like, what should we name it? And my coworker Joe was like, I always wanted to name something Kevin. So I was like, fine, Kevin. And then that was
there
it.
you have it.
There you have it. I had like an old manager who I was an intern, who loved the idea of giving things like human-ish names, because then it builds a little bit of empathy with the thing. I don't actually know how valid that is, but I always keep that in the back of my head. It's like, oh, okay, well, yeah. Anyways, so we knew. I wrote pages and pages of nonsense notes about the genesis of Kevin, I ended up like, I wrote the bulk of it, but like I wrote this with like a lot of other people on the team who were tackling different parts of the Webpack migration. And I have to say that the Webpack, like the migration to Webpack is pretty tightly entangled with like the problems around Kevin. Like Kevin itself is like a pretty simple solution to like this kind of weird problem, but like it was very much like the problems that we had with Kevin were more problems with the migration that we ended up like tweaking in Kevin, for example. But to like give a high level overview, we have a giant code base. When Webpack starts up, its first instinct is to build everything and load it into memory, so that if you wanted to do iterative rebuilds, it knows which files to watch, it knows which dependencies need to be updated, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever you do this with a monorepo, you need 60, 50 gigs of RAM just around. And this is for like every single one of our developers. And at the time we were, our setup kind of looks like every developer has a virtual machine that they do most of their work on, and they SSH into it, or they use remote code editing with like PHP Storm or VS Code or whichever editor they want to use, but everything runs on this one virtual machine. And we, up until a few years ago, were mostly an on-prem company. So all these machines were real machines somewhere out in the real world. And as we were migrating to the cloud, we were migrating these virtual machines to the cloud, which meant that we were resource constrained during the migration. So, asking the provisioning team, hey, can we just triple the amount of RAM and processors on all of our virtual machines during this process that's like extremely taxing and like very delicate, was not like a question that we could ask. So we ended up trying to decide to see, first of all, how we could improve Webpack's build speeds, and we tried writing custom plugins, and we came up with a bunch of really novel solutions to handling things like building, 12 or 13 copies of a file in 12 or 13 different languages without running a full Webpack build 12 or 13 times. But we couldn't really get around the fact that as our code base grew, Webpack still needed to build the whole code base. We could, reduce the memory footprint per file, but it was still like going to increase with the input. So Kevin was kind of the solution that we came to as a compromise. And the way that we do that is we treat our giant monorepo as a series of user experiences. And what I mean by user experience is like a collection of JavaScript files that fit a particular use case. So for example, we have a region that corresponds to the happy path that buyers take when they navigate Etsy.com. The homepage, the listing page, the cart page, etc. We have a region that corresponds to our seller tools. We have a region that corresponds to our internal tools. We have, regions for each of these different pockets of the code base that we treat in isolation. And we have a Webpack config that we generate for each of these regions. And it essentially is Kevin's responsibility to manage compilers for each of these regions. I have, well, first of all, do you have any questions?
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, the first thing that came to mind is there's got to be some overlap between these regions. Is there overlap, in fact, and if there is, do you care?
Good question. So we do not allow there to be overlap between regions. And the reason for that is because when Webpack builds a file, it needs to have a location for where to build it. And we need to be able to tell Webpack that, this directory here is where you output this region's code. So if we were to have collisions between regions, they would cause collisions on disk. And if we were to want to have a file shared between experiences, it probably belongs in a different region altogether. So for example, I think every company has unless you're one of the blessed few to have very good discipline and foresight, everybody has some sort of horrible global JavaScript base file that they've had to figure out at one point. And we have a region for files like that exist kind of between user experiences, and there's maybe a dozen of those files. And we build them together because we'd like to optimize them together. Another aspect of these regions is that because they correspond to a specific Webpack config, and this kind of goes back to how we treat tooling in different pipelines that the one listener asked about. Because each of those regions correspond to a different Webpack config, we can create customizations per Webpack config that optimize a specific experience. So like for example, in our seller tools, which is a heavily React driven application, we have a vendor library that knows to extract React and Redux and immutable schema, immutable.js, and a number of other tools into its own file that is specific to that region, so that those libraries can be cached as people navigate around the different routes or different asynchronously loaded modules. So that if you leave and you come back, that file is still likely to be cached because nothing in it is likely to be changed.
Who is it that maintains these region files?
The users themselves maintain it. So we wanted to make sure that, like, part of this is making sure that the build system for users is as like low touch as possible. You know, we didn't want people to have to worry about spinning up and turning things off and managing Webpack configurations. We thought that was like things that were good that people had access to and availability to, but that's not day-to-day what people need to worry about. So we have one file called, we call it regions.json, which defines the files that we want, the entry points that we want to build in our code base, like the point at which the rest of the dependency graph originates from. And users add things to this list, and each list is inside of a region. So it's essentially a nested list. Or, you know, it's like an object containing arrays, one for each region. And to make that a little bit easier, we actually have a command line tool that makes it easy to add and remove things from this regions file. And then at build time, we actually convert this regions file into a collection of Webpack configs that we then feed to whichever Webpack instance we want, whether it's Kevin in development or whether it's just a copy of Webpack that we use for deployment.
And Kevin is open source, correct? It's something that you
Yes.
sort of put out there. So I guess I'm going to drop a link here in the chat. So I'm curious, like, what encouraged Etsy to just put this work out there, right? I'm always curious about the motivations behind that sort of thing. And then like B, if people are interested in like getting involved, if they have a similar problem, like what's sort of the next steps for anybody interested in doing that sort of thing?
Great question. And I know we're like maybe getting close to the end of time here, so I'll try to like be a little bit more direct with my rambling.
Maybe we could wrap up on this, and I'll also say too, we've been getting some great questions from chat. If you have any last things you want to ask, now's a good time to get those in here too before we start to wrap up.
Yeah, certainly. Also, I guess it goes without saying, I'm happy to like answer questions on Twitter if this chat has to end early or things like that. But in terms of open sourcing this, Etsy historically has open sourced a lot of things, but in the past few years, that process kind of became stale. So part of the work around this was we actually like kind of went into this. I was like maybe a little bit eager about this, but we like decided that we wanted Kevin to be something that we open sourced because it was something that we found useful. It was something that we could nicely encapsulate. So we actually like, as part of this, revamped the process through which people can open source code from Etsy. Now there's like an open source working group at Etsy. We discuss new projects, things like that. You know, there's we have like a process for this now. Like we make sure that legal takes a look at it. We make sure that it's code reviewed by staff engineers. We make sure there's documentation, and there's a plan for maintaining this in the long term. So if people find Kevin something useful, which I really hope, because I feel like we're not the only people who have this problem.
The name really is awesome. Like I just love being able to say phrases just like, if you find Kevin useful, then
I don't know if you want to share
Kevin
this slide, but we
Blame
I was very proud of
Kevin.
this.
Yeah, exactly.
I was very proud of this photo for the JS conference talk. And just Kevin just running around with a bunch of Webpacks, and I think it's supposed to be a bowl of chili, like a giant bucket of chili.
It's great.
But it's something that we found really useful, and we found it was like a problem that anybody who had a monorepo must be facing some variation of this problem. And I'm sure they're trying to solve it in like a number of different ways. This is our way, so perhaps it's something that other people can find useful. Yeah, and that being said, there's there's plenty of work to be done here. Like it needs to be ready for Webpack 5, which is next on the roadmap. It needs to be able to support Webpack's built-in Webpack's HTML plugin. which it doesn't do out of the box. There is like pieces of work, but for our use case, it works really well.
Did you talk with the Webpack crew about this, either before, during, or after?
A little bit. There is some back and forth. I sent some DMs to I think Sean Larkin at the time, who was very supportive and who like helped put us in touch with people who had similar solutions in other places. But because there's nothing that quite fit our use case, it like still made sense to keep working on this. Part of how Kevin works is it actually accounts for the fact that the first Webpack build can take a while the cache warms up, while things get loaded into memory, and it shows this kind of funky little overlay, which I don't even know if I can find really quickly. But
it's on slide 189, I think. I'm kidding. It's a lot of slides.
I was like, wow, how did you know that? I have a lot of slides, but my whole deal is I go through them very quickly. But this is the overlay that people see whenever Kevin is building.
Fancy.
Yeah, and it knows whenever it's just started a compiler that it should probably show this overlay because it'll take some time. But one of the I think one of the comments on this was that now that Webpack 5 includes a built-in disk cache, startup times will be much faster. So that might be something you want to think about.
What kind of support do you get from leadership around the extra work required to maintain and push an open source project forward, even if it's one that you're using internally?
That's a great question. Because open source has been something that Etsy has done routinely in the past, it wasn't such a heavy lift to ask for like time to do open source work. And in fact, like part of the requirement for open sourcing something is developing a plan for how often you will meet to talk about pull requests and issues and things like that.
Oh, nice.
Because the last thing people want are to like have a project that just goes live and then goes stale.
Yep.
One of the things that we kind of promised was that we would be using the same copy of Kevin that's publicly available internally, so that if there are problems, we would need to fix them publicly rather than just patch them internally and fork and then diverge.
Excellent. That's good to hear, because you don't always get that kind of support from leadership when you start talking about, adding work that is maybe, I mean, it's relevant obviously to what you guys are doing in-house, but not necessarily 100% driving the bottom line, right?
Yeah, and kind of in the same note, we're like still trying to figure out, like one thing that our team and other teams have been pushing for is, now that we've been using more open source software, it seems right that we should be donating to these open source organizations, like Webpack Foundation, for example. They are saving us the cost of maintaining and implementing a build system from scratch. Like right. it is in our best interest to make sure that they keep doing well. Exactly. Like
that's how open source is supposed to work, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that like part of the thing we're still working on is like how to make sure that we are giving to open source organizations, not just like in a one-off ad hoc manner, but like we are continuing to do this. We have a process for doing this. So that's something that we're working on still.
Yeah, that's a really great mature attitude. TJ and Dan Skaggs and I both have had the pleasure and pain of helping and contributing to open source tools and frameworks in the past. And, it can turn into almost a free buffet option, and people forget that there's people in the back chopping up the meat and putting it in the table. So, it's great to hear Etsy sort of sees this as a push-pull relationship. And I think a lot of companies are kind of waking up to the fact that they're gaining a whole lot of value out of this ecosystem, and it doesn't really take that much to give back a little bit. And that's what keeps the merry-go-round spinning.
It's funny, Dan, to continue your metaphor, it's not only like a free buffet, but it's like a free buffet where like people in like pull up to in Lamborghinis and suits, because I think it's only frustrating. Like if like some college kid is using your open source project, you're like, whatever, right? Like you're probably doing something to learn or whatever. But it's like major corporations making millions or billions of dollars off your things, just taking and using it for free is where the equation seems kind of off a little bit. So I'll plus one what Dan said too, that it's kind of cool to see the attitude towards that at Etsy.
Yeah, I mean, truly, like the entirety of the team that I work on right now used to be focused on building and maintaining and iterating this build system, and now we're like, what's the best way to adopt TypeScript? How can we rethink experimentation? Like we have time and availability to like plan really big again, and we don't have to worry about, oh no, every time we get rebase, the thing overloads and we have to restart it. Like it's not we don't have to worry about that anymore. So
is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to plug about really anything at this point, monorepos or Kevin? And then follow up to that too, is there any like links? I can post your like Twitter handle in here, like ways of following up for anybody that's watching this later. This will be up on YouTube and such for anybody that wants to follow up on any of this.
I think that's a great question. The Code is Craft article that I authored, the whole Code is Craft blog is actually really like it's an honor to be able to write for that sort of stuff, just because it's just so bold and so full of really just great writing. But I wrote that Code is Craft piece about the existence of Kevin. One of my former teammates, John Lai, wrote a bit about how we productionized Webpack and talked a little bit about that half of the thing of our process. Salem.io is my personal website. There's a link to my JSConf talk there if you want to see what all these slides are coming from.
An awesome domain, by the way.
Oh yeah.
Oh, thank you.
It rolls off the tongue nicely.
I know. I took me like years to do anything with it, but I finally put like a jarring yellow website there. So I think the one thing that I can't, I guess there are two things I can't stress enough that I think we all learned from doing this project. And one is that like big projects take a long time and you have to be patient with them, and you have to like explain why it takes time to do them to people who are above you. We like thought we would be shipping this about 6 months before we actually shipped this, and it was because we needed to take time to measure correctly. We needed to understand what sort of performance numbers we were seeing. We needed to understand how Webpack ran in the browser that differed from how Require.js ran in the browser. We ended up writing a bunch of custom tooling to better understand these things, and that took time, but we wanted to make sure we got this right because this is something that touched every single page on Etsy.com. And I guess the other thing is that like we spent a lot of time making sure the user experience was good and not just the tooling, and I think that paid off hugely. We don't need to field questions about whether or not people should start or stop Webpack instances. We spent a lot of time writing documentation. We made sure that everything was really easy to understand, and when it wasn't, we spent time thinking about how to fix it. I think your technical implementation always has a cap on the user experience. It's always capped by the user experience, and I think if you don't spend time developing a good user experience around your tooling, then you're going to ultimately be hamstrung, no matter how good or how fast your build system is.
Yeah, I think the other message that might get lost here is that, all things have limits. And if you're operating at the scale that you're operating at with 200 plus engineers and 12,000 JavaScript modules, certain recipes that you find on the internet just don't work. And they require extra thought, or in your case, building middleware to make the build process work. And JavaScript is JavaScript, but JavaScript at scale is something totally different.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples I always reach for here is if we were to use the off-the-shelf localization solution that Webpack at the time, I think this is now deprecated, but at the time that Webpack had as a plugin, we would have ended up having to build all of our code base once per locale, and that would have increased the time of our deploys like pretty sharply.
Wow.
So we ended up writing a solution that uses a lot of the code in between builds, and that this is a whole other half-hour diatribe, so I won't go into that too much. But
yeah, no, we might have to have you back on because this has been a fascinating conversation. I know I've certainly learned a ton about all this. So I do want to say, I don't think I've seen any other questions in chat. I think I've gotten all the links. You can tell me if I miss anything, but I've got your Twitter if people want to follow along, the blog post you referred to, domain and such as well. So we'll get those in on YouTube in the description as well. So if you want to follow along on any of those, check those out. And Salem, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a really awesome chat.
This is my pleasure. This is fantastic meeting you all and getting to talk with you.
And then I've got a few last plugs to end with. So we're on the Code It Live channel here on React Wednesdays. There is a follow button and Twitch somewhere where you're viewing this. If you want to get notified of future streams, check that out. We have streams all the time. React Wednesdays every Wednesday at 1. Dan Skaggs. Dan, I'm gonna have to start calling you like Wilson and Skaggs.
Well,
That's what we call
do when we're
Oh,
together.
yeah.
That's what our wives call us too.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really bad sitcom, honestly. But
Well,
Really good
imagine
sitcom.
imagine both of us being on the same project together several years ago.
oh god. Well, Skaggs will be joining us next week, Wednesday, 1 Eastern. So you want to tune in, especially if you enjoyed this, because the topic's going to be fairly similar and we're going to dig a little bit deeper. So you want to do that. And Dan, I know you've got one plug you want to give as well. So you should do it. Go full marketing here.
Heck yeah. We found Salem through through an article you wrote as part of our Enterprise React newsletter process, which is a newsletter that our whole team puts together. They find the articles and we write up the coolest ones. And so that's how we found Salem. And so if you like this kind of content, Google Enterprise React newsletter and subscribe. We do not sell your email, just pure content every 2 weeks.
And you can trust Dan. I mean, just look at him. He looks like a very trustworthy guy. What would he do with your contact information, right? Nothing nefarious for sure.
Nothing nefarious.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks again, Salem. Until next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a good one.